Dark clouds loomed over London as James Carter, a simple man with an ordinary life, walked home after his late-night shift. He had always been an honest, hard-working man, living paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment, far from the extravagant lives of the city's elite. That night, he had no idea his life was about to change forever. The next morning, he was jolted awake by the sound of police sirens and the forceful banging on his door. Before he could comprehend what was happening, officers stormed in, guns drawn, dragging him out of bed. Confused and terrified, James was handcuffed and shoved into the back of a police car, his pleas of innocence ignored. The charge was unthinkable: murder. The victim? Richard Langley, a billionaire investor with deep political connections. As the news spread, the media painted James as a cold-blooded killer. Every piece of evidence seemed to confirm his guilt: his fingerprints on the murder weapon, his DNA at the crime scene, and surveillance footage capturing a man resembling him fleeing the area. The trial was swift and ruthless, the prosecution portraying him as a desperate man who had killed Langley for money. His defense attorney barely put up a fight. Within weeks, James was convicted and sentenced to life in the maximum security prison of Belmarsh. Inside those merciless prison walls, James found himself in a world far worse than he could have imagined. Guards treated him like scum, allowing violent inmates to beat him for sport. Days turned into weeks, then months, then years. The system was designed to break him, but James held onto a fragile thread of hope. He knew he had been framed, but proving it from behind bars seemed impossible. As the years dragged on, he became a ghost of his former self, his name forgotten by the outside world. But fate had other plans. In the depths of despair, a flicker of hope emerged when Evelyn Harper, an investigative journalist known for exposing wrongful convictions, stumbled upon his case. What started as a routine inquiry quickly turned into an obsession. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became James had been set up. The evidence had been tampered with, key witnesses had been silenced, and the entire case reeked of corruption. Determined to uncover the truth, Evelyn followed a dangerous trail that led her to Langley's business rival, Victor Sinclair, a powerful figure with deep ties to law enforcement and the criminal underworld. The more she dug, the more dangerous it became. Anonymous threats, mysterious car accidents, and hacked devices warned her to back off. But she refused. She needed help. And she found it in former Detective Henry Vaughn, a man who had been forced into early retirement after questioning. The system won too many times. Together they began piecing together the puzzle, uncovering a powerful secret society operating within London's elite, pulling strings behind the scenes to control politics, business, and law enforcement. As Evelyn and Henry fought to expose the truth, James continued to endure the horrors of prison. He had learned to navigate the dangerous power dynamics within Belmarsh, but surviving each day was a battle. He was constantly watched, his every move scrutinized. When word got out that an investigation was reopening his case, the threats inside the prison escalated. Someone didn't want him to get out. As the conspiracy unraveled outside, James faced an attempt on his life, an orchestrated attack in the prison yard meant to silence him forever. But he fought back, barely escaping with his life. The attack only strengthened Evelyn's resolve. She pushed harder, finally uncovering irrefutable evidence proving James's innocence. Documents revealing Sinclair's secret dealings, bribed officials, and manipulated forensic reports came to light. The pressure mounted, and soon the case was forced back into court. The retrial was a media frenzy. The public, once convinced of James's guilt, now watched in shock as layer after layer of deception was peeled away. Witnesses who had once testified against him came forward with confessions they had been threatened or paid off. The judge presiding over James's original case had been blackmailed. Even the lead detective had ties to Sinclair. When the final piece of evidence was revealed, surveillance footage proving James had been miles away when the murder occurred, the courtroom fell silent. The judge, unable to deny the overwhelming proof, overturned James's conviction. After over 30 years, behind bars, James Carter walked out a free man. But his nightmare was far from over. He was no longer just an innocent man seeking justice. He was now a threat to the very system that had wrongfully imprisoned him. The powerful figures behind the conspiracy had lost a battle, but they weren't ready to lose the war. As James took his first breath of freedom, he knew one thing: this was just the beginning. He was being watched, hunted, and the fight for truth had only just begun. As James attempted to rebuild his life, he quickly realized that freedom came with its own dangers. The world outside had changed drastically in 30 years. Technology had advanced, the city had transformed, and the people he once knew had moved on. But one thing remained the same: the power of those who had put him behind bars. The threats didn't stop. Mysterious figures followed him. Anonymous warnings were left at his doorstep, and his every move was monitored. Evelyn and Henry worked tirelessly to keep him safe while exposing the deeper layers of the conspiracy. With every revelation, the stakes grew higher. Corrupt officials, high-profile businessmen, and even law enforcement were involved in a web of deceit that stretched beyond what they had initially imagined. James was not just a victim of a wrongful conviction, he had become an obstacle in a much larger game. Determined to fight back, James refused to live in fear. He began working with Evelyn and Henry, determined to bring down those who had orchestrated his suffering. But the deeper they dug, the deadlier the consequences became. As they uncovered shocking truths about Langley's murder, it became clear that James's conviction had been more than just a mistake. It had been a calculated move in a much larger scheme. The powerful forces behind it would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. When a key witness was found dead under mysterious circumstances, James knew that their time was running out. If they didn't act fast, they would be silenced permanently. With every passing day, the battle for justice intensified. The media's interest grew, public opinion began to shift, and protests erupted demanding accountability. But as the pressure mounted, so did the danger. James had spent decades behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. But now he was in a different kind of persona, relentless fight for survival against an enemy that thrived in the shadows. The war had only begun, and James knew that the road ahead would be more treacherous than anything he had faced before. But he was no longer the broken man who had entered Belmarsh decades ago. He was ready to fight back, no matter the cost. Because this time it wasn't just about his freedom, it was about exposing the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. The battle lines had been drawn, and James Carter was prepared to take on the fight of his life. James Carter had spent over 30 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. And while the world had moved on, he was still trapped in the nightmare that had begun the night of his wrongful arrest. Freedom had not brought him peace, it had only ushered in a new battle, one that would test his resilience beyond measure. The media was relentless, some portraying him as a tragic figure of injustice, while others fueled conspiracy theories about his past. But none of them truly understood the weight of the danger looming over him. The people responsible for his imprisonment were still out there, powerful figures with deep political and financial influence, and they were determined to erase any traces of their crimes, even if it meant eliminating James and those helping him. Evelyn Harper and Henry Vaughan worked tirelessly to gather more evidence, knowing that proving James's innocence wasn't enough. They needed to bring down the entire network of corruption that had orchestrated his conviction. But with every step they took, the shadows closed in. Strange cars parked outside Evelyn's apartment, threatening phone calls in the middle of the night and emails that vanished before they could be traced. These were just the beginning. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that James had unknowingly been a pawn in a much larger game. James, refusing to be a mere victim, decided to take matters into his own hands. He knew that if he was ever going to have a real life again, he had to go on the offensive. With Evelyn's investigative prowess and Henry's experience in law enforcement, they followed a lead that took them to an underground organization known as the Sovereign Order, a secret society composed of elite politicians, business tycoons, and law enforcement officials who manipulated justice to serve their own interests. It became clear that Richard Langley's murder had not been a random act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated assassination to protect a secret only a handful of people knew about. The closer James and his team got to the truth, the deadlier the threats became. One evening, as James returned to the small apartment he had been staying in, he noticed the door slightly ajar. His heart pounded as he cautiously entered, finding the place ransacked. Scattered papers, overturned furniture, and a chilling message, smeared on the wall in red paint. "Stop digging, or you'll wish you never left Belmarsh." The warning was clear, but James had already spent decades being silenced. He wasn't about to stop now. Evelyn and Henry tracked down an ex-detective named Marcus Reed, a man who had worked on James's case but had been forced into hiding after attempting to expose corruption within the police department. When they found him, he was living off the grid, a paranoid shell of the man he once was. "You don't understand what you're up against," he warned. "These people don't just kill you, they erase you. Your existence, your past, your future, everything. They make sure no one remembers you were ever here." But Marcus had kept evidence, documents he had stolen before going underground. In those files, they found names, high-ranking officials, wealthy businessmen, and even members of the intelligence community who had been involved in framing James. With this newfound information, James and his allies took a dangerous step forward. They leaked part of the documents to the press, knowing that public exposure was their only real weapon. The world needed to see the depth of the corruption that had stolen decades of James's life, but the response was swift and brutal. Media. Outlets were mysteriously shut down. Journalists who covered the story found their careers ruined overnight, and a well-known whistleblower connected to the case was found dead in an apparent suicide. The message was clear. They would stop at nothing to silence James once and for all. Then came the final blow. Henry Vaughn was attacked outside his home. He survived, but barely. The assailants left no evidence, no trace of their identity, but the message was clear: stop now, or suffer the consequences. James was done running. He had spent over 30 years being beaten down, forgotten, and ignored. Now he was ready to fight back. Determined to take the battle straight to the source, James, Evelyn, and a now recovered Henry planned one final desperate move. They would infiltrate a private gathering of the Sovereign Order, held in the heart of London, where the most powerful figures gathered to make decisions that shaped the world. If they could expose them in real time, live-stream the confessions, and release every piece of evidence they had collected, they might just stand a chance at bringing the entire operation down. But walking into the lion's den meant risking everything. James knew that if this failed, there would be no escape. As they prepared for the final showdown, he looked in the mirror, seeing not the broken man who had once entered Belmarsh, but a man ready to take back the life that had been stolen from him. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in decades, he held the power to change his fate, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. James, Evelyn, and Henry executed their plan with precision. Disguised as waitstaff, they infiltrated the exclusive gathering of the Sovereign Order in a grand hall deep within London's underground elite. Hidden cameras streamed the event live to thousands watching online. As the members toasted to their continued power, James stepped forward, microphone in hand, and exposed their crimes. Panic erupted as security closed in. Some attendees attempted to flee, while others furiously denied the allegations. Henry fought off guards while Evelyn uploaded the last batch of evidence. But just as victory seemed within reach, a gunshot rang out. James collapsed, blood spreading across his shirt. Chaos ensued, screams echoing as the Sovereign Order scrambled to cover up the event. But it was too late. The truth had been broadcast to the world. As paramedics rushed James to the hospital, headlines exploded with the biggest scandal in modern history. The Sovereign Order was exposed, their empire crumbling. High-profile arrests followed, and justice finally began to take shape. James, though wounded, had won. He had reclaimed his life and dismantled the system that had stolen it from him. And as he watched the sun rise over London, he knew this was just the beginning of a new battle won, where he would fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by corruption. James Carter had survived the impossible, but he knew that taking down the Sovereign Order had only been the beginning. Though the leaders of the secretive and corrupt organization had been exposed, the system they had built was still intact. Corrupt officials, law enforcement officers, and political figures who had orchestrated his imprisonment remained free, some in hiding, others preparing to retaliate. James was no longer just a man seeking justice. He had become a symbol of resistance against the deeply entrenched corruption that had plagued the world for decades. As he recovered from his gunshot wound, Evelyn Harper and Henry Vaughan worked tirelessly to ensure that the evidence they had uncovered continued to circulate. However, their battle was far from over. A shadow war had begun, with hidden forces working relentlessly to bury the truth once more. Mysterious deaths of key whistleblowers, inexplicable legal roadblocks, and sudden reversals of testimonies suggested that the reach of the Sovereign Order extended far beyond what they had initially believed. James, now under constant surveillance by unknown operatives, knew that he could no longer afford to sit and wait for justice to take its course. He had to dismantle the remnants of the organization from the inside. With Evelyn's investigative prowess and Henry's law enforcement connections, they began tracking down former members who had turned against the Order, people who had been betrayed, discarded, or were now in hiding out of fear. Their first lead took them to Paris, where a former high-ranking intelligence officer named Laurent Dupont had sought refuge after defecting from the Order. Dupont, once a trusted enforcer, had been marked for elimination when he refused to execute, an order that would have led to the assassination of an influential journalist. When James and his team found him, Dupont was living under a false identity, terrified that at any moment the remnants of the Sovereign Order would finish what they had started. "They never truly disappear," Dupont warned, as he hesitantly agreed to help. "Even now they are shifting their power into new forms, infiltrating new institutions, rebranding their operations under different names. You may have cut off the head, but the body is still moving." Armed with Dupont's knowledge of the Sovereign Order's hidden assets and secret banking channels, James and his team followed the money. It led them to Dubai, where billions of dollars had been funneled into shadow corporations controlled by anonymous entities. Here the trail grew even more dangerous. Those who protected these financial networks were not mere criminals. They were some of the world's most powerful financiers, shielded by governments, intelligence agencies, and private security forces, willing to kill to keep their secrets safe. As they delved deeper, the resistance against them intensified. Evelyn narrowly escaped an assassination attempt when a sniper targeted her in a crowded street. Henry was falsely implicated in an international money laundering scheme, forcing him into hiding. James himself was ambushed in a high-speed car chase through the neon-lit streets of Dubai, barely escaping with his life. But these attacks only hardened their resolve. James knew that the only way to truly destroy the Sovereign Order was to hit them where it hurt the most: their wealth, their influence, and their ability to operate in the shadows. Working with international journalists, rogue intelligence operatives, and cyber activists, they launched a coordinated assault on the Order's remaining power structures. They hacked into offshore accounts, exposed illegal transactions, and released classified documents detailing decades of manipulation, extortion, and murder. The world watched in shock as one by one, high-profile figures were arrested, forced to resign, or mysteriously vanished. Governments were thrown into chaos as scandals erupted. Civil unrest spread, as people realized the extent to which their institutions had been compromised. But with every victory, the danger increased. The Sovereign Order's last surviving members, now cornered, became even more desperate. In a final, desperate move, they orchestrated a large-scale terrorist attack designed to distract the world from their impending downfall. Explosions rocked financial districts, cyber attacks crippled global markets, and political leaders were assassinated in rapid succession. It became clear that this was their endgame. If they couldn't control the world, they would burn it to the ground. James, Evelyn, and Henry, now working alongside an underground resistance movement composed of former intelligence officers, journalists, and activists, had to act fast. They orchestrated a daring infiltration into the last known headquarters of the Order, an underground fortress hidden beneath an abandoned military base in Eastern Europe. It was here that the final battle took place, a war not just of weapons, but of information. Infiltrating the base, James and his team broadcasted live footage of the Order's last-ditch efforts to retain power. The world watched in real time. As the remaining leaders of the organization were unmasked, their crimes laid bare before billions. But in their final act of defiance, the Order's leaders triggered a catastrophic fail-safe, a global economic collapse that would plunge nations into chaos. James, wounded but relentless, fought to stop it. In a desperate struggle against the mastermind behind the Order, a man known only as the Architect, James faced his greatest test. The Architect, a man who had operated in the shadows for decades, revealed the ultimate truth. The Sovereign Order had never been about control. It had been about survival. "We are not the disease, James," the Architect sneered as he activated the final sequence to plunge the world into irreversible chaos. "We are the cure." With one final act of defiance, James overpowered the Architect and stopped the failsafe. As security forces stormed the base, the last remnants of the Sovereign Order were finally wiped out. The world, though shaken, had been saved from total ruin. But James knew the battle would never truly be over. Corruption, power, and greed would always find new forms, new faces. Yet, for the first time in decades, he felt free. As he stood atop the ruins of the Order's last stronghold, watching the sunrise over a world that had finally seen the truth, he made a silent vow he would never stop fighting, because justice was not a destination. It was a battle that never ended.